Hi, I'm Kim, and I run a small front-end development agency in Copenhagen called Shift. At Shift, our mission is to make the web a better place. And one of the ways we try and do that is by focusing on accessibility. Today, I'll be taking you through the process of building an accessible button. Before we get started with the buttons, let's just define what I mean by the term accessible. Personally, I really like this statement from the Drupal website, which states that your site's content, design, and interface should be available to all users on the internet, regardless of their abilities or the assistive technologies they use. In more concrete terms though, for something to be accessible, it has to adhere to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, also known as WCAG. Those come in three levels: A, AA, and AAA. And when most people talk about accessibility, they're referring to the AA standard, which is also what our button will conform to. Right, I've gone ahead and cheated a bit. I've created these three buttons, or three variants of the same button, and we're not going to go through all the CSS required to build these buttons, only the stuff that's really important for accessibility. First off, we should always use a semantic HTML. We've known that for a long time, but this is especially important when it comes to interactive elements, meaning no more clickable divs or clickable spans. We should always use one of these three elements when it comes to buttons: the anchor element, the button element, or the input element with a type attribute of either button, reset, or submit. Now, which one to choose depends on the functionality of the button and the context in which it exists. I would like to refer to the CSS Tricks article linked at the bottom of this slide, which has a very short intro and very clear indication of what to use when. For our buttons, I've gone ahead and used the button element. As you can see, these are our three buttons and they share a similar pattern. It's a button wrapper with a span element for text and an SVG for our icon. I've cleaned up the SVG markup a bit so that our slides are nice and clean. That's it. Semantic buttons, very easy. Secondly, contrast ratio. This is one of the most common violations of the accessibility guidelines, a lack of required contrast ratio. Contrast ratio is very complicated to calculate, but luckily there are tools out there that will do this for us. Here's a screenshot of the web developer tools in Chrome showing us that the contrast ratio between our white text and the green background is 3.03. The little red icon next to it tells us this is insufficient. That's because the required contrast ratio according to the guidelines is 4.5 to 1 between text and the button background. Now there's also a requirement between the button background and the background upon which the button is placed that is 3 to 1. Since we're working with white, we know that that contrast ratio is okay for now. We have two ways to enhance the contrast ratio here. Either make the text lighter or the button background darker. Considering the text is already white, we're going to have to go with darker. See, I'm not going to say that this is as pretty as before, but it obviously makes the text a lot easier to read. And the Chrome developer tools now tells us that the contrast ratio is 5 to 1. This is sufficient, and we've now met that specification. Now, let's move on to the focus state of a button. The focus state is applied when a user clicks the button or whenever you traverse through the button, traverse through the elements of the web page and stumble upon the button or an input field or whatever. A lot of people remove that visual indication because designers in particular don't like the design to be messed up with this, the default focus outlines. As you can see, there's not a lot of consistency between the modern browsers and the operating systems, and especially the Firefox implementation leaves a lot to be desired. We've learned long ago that things do not need to look the same in all browsers, but there are ways that we can improve the outline here, or the focus state, visual focus state, while pleasing designers and also making it easy for the users to see no matter what operating system or browser they choose to use. So let's go ahead and do that. Here are the 4 lines of CSS that we'll be using. In line 2, we'll be removing the default outline. That's what's normally called the focus ring. Please be aware, this is considered harmful, especially if you don't add the third line, which we're going to do now. That is 2 box shadows, a white and a green, leaving our default focus outline to look like this. It's clear, it's obvious, and by using something like box shadow instead of a border, we won't be affecting the layout or the box model of the button, meaning that users won't see any shifts in layout when the focus is applied. Now, this is where it becomes interesting. A lot of users use screen readers. Those can be users with visual impairments, or they can be suffering from a temporary disability such as concussion, where they're not allowed to look at a screen. There are a lot of screen readers out there. Both Windows and Mac come with a built-in screen readers, and we'll be using the one for the Mac. It's called VoiceOver, and it comes with a handy graphical user interface looking like this. As you can see, it has identified that there are 3 buttons on the page. However, for our icon-only button, it has no content, meaning that the user will have no chance of knowing what that button actually does. They'll just be told they are now on a button. We have to do something about that, because this is not only bad for the user, it's also bad for business. There are 2 ways we can do this. We can add an area label, which is something out of scope for this talk, or we can add actual content. Now, I prefer actual content, because if for some reason our CSS doesn't load, the text will show up in the button on the screen anyways. And this is a great example of progressive enhancement. What we'll do is we'll add a class called SR-only, screen reader only, and the styles in that class, the CSS properties that you see on the bottom of this slide, is hiding the content in an inclusive manner, meaning it will hide it visually, but not for assistive technologies. This is what VoiceOver now tells us. 3 buttons, all with the text of add to basket. This is great and easy. Now, screen readers is not the only assistive technology we have to test for. We also have to test for high contrast mode, which is something a user in Windows can enable. High contrast mode does exactly what it says on the tin, and it makes it very clear that design is secondary to functionality. Here are our so-called buttons in high contrast mode, except they no longer look like buttons at all. They look like regular text, and there's no clear indication that these can be clicked or chosen or whatever. Luckily, there's a media query for this. Many of you have probably used media queries for building responsive web designs. And this media query is only applied when the user has high contrast mode enabled in Windows. What we're going to do is we're going to reapply the border that we removed in our initial button class, and that will probably fix it. Now, just 2 things to note here actually. First of all, I'm using the current color value for our border color. I'll get back to that in a second, but please notice this. Secondly, Firefox doesn't support this media query, so be careful when to use it or not. Right, here are our buttons. They now work, and they look like buttons in a black and white version, but still look like buttons. Now, the reason that I used current color for the border color is that there are a few different high contrast modes to choose from. And by using current color, I don't have to pick a specific color for each one of those high contrast modes. I'll just let the browser decide for me, and operating system in this case. Now, here's a little fun fact about high contrast mode, which I'm guessing a lot of people just shrug their shoulders and say, whoever uses that. Well, in February 2019, the W3C CSS working group declared that 4% of all active Windows machines have high contrast mode enabled. So that's a substantial amount of people. We have to get back to the focus state, because as you saw, high contrast mode is a bit picky when it comes to what CSS properties to respect or not. One of the things they don't respect is box shadows, which just happens to be what we used for our focus state. And this shows, because in this screenshot, one of these buttons actually has the focus state enabled, but it's invisible to our users. Luckily, our work on the focus state is not wasted. Right. Remember that outline none that we applied earlier? That removes the outline completely. Instead, we can actually split that outline up in some other properties. Here we have outline solid, outline style solid, and outline color transparent. This will apply the outline in all browsers. But in browsers where high contrast mode is not turned on, it'll be transparent. But what about high contrast mode? Well, transparency is one of those things that high contrast mode doesn't really care about, meaning that we'll have maybe not the prettiest focus state. It's a big white square box, and I'm guessing that I didn't pick white, by the way. The operating system in the browser did that for me. I'm guessing that's probably going by current color as well. But it's definitely clear and visible and very obvious which button is currently the active element. So that's it. In summary, always use semantic HTML. You have to work with the contrast ratio and make sure that the contrast ratio between button text and button background and the background upon which the button is placed and the button background are sufficient. Remember, don't mess with focus styles unless you test thoroughly, because as you can see, in high contrast mode, that can really be a problem. You have to test in screen readers, and you should also test in high contrast mode. See, we've made accessible buttons and it wasn't that hard. And with that, thanks for watching, and thanks to the All Day Hey crew for having me. If you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at @overflowhidden, and hopefully I'll see you all in Leeds next year for the next All Day Hey. Until then, please take care of yourselves. Thanks.